Pamela Paul is a Gen Xer who sounds like a boomer, and she describes herself as a pro-choice feminist. Unless, of course, you're a woman making choices that Pamela Paul doesn't think that you should be making. For those of you who don't know who Pamela Paul is, she's a former opinion writer for the New York Times who's now doing journalism, I guess, for the Wall Street Journal, much to the consternation of trans people and sex workers, neither of whom she thinks should exist. And in case any of you guys think that that characterization is unfair, here are some of the things that Pamela Paul has published. Now, I first came across Paul's work when she wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times several years ago entitled, "What It Means to Call Prostitution Sex Work." I wrote a response piece to that for the Huffington Post entitled, "I'm a sex worker, and here's why calling me one matters." So I knew what I was getting into when Paul reached out to me, and I knew that she talked to several of my colleagues, many of whom are experts on human trafficking and public health and public policy, none of whom she chose to quote. Recently, Pamela Paul published a piece entitled "How Defending Prostitution Has Become a Progressive Cause," which I wish were true. And she chose to open it with, "Don't pity the prostitute. Instead, fight for her rights," a sentiment Paul objects to which I say, yeah, girl. I read this piece, so you don't have to. And it opens with, "No longer derided as hookers or harlots, mourned as fallen women, or sugar-coated as high-end call girls, the sex worker," a job title that sounds like the handiwork of an Orwellian HR department, but is considered by many progressives as the most inclusive and respectful term, is a free market operative like any other. Sex work is work, say those who see prostitution as a form of choice, empowerment, and bodily autonomy. My favorite part of this quote is that she uses the word hooker and harlot, but sex worker is the only word she puts in quotes. Pamela gives a fair and factual summation and history of the sex worker rights movement and our expanded influence over culture and major human rights and public health institutions. And she sums up this incredible achievement that has been decades in the making with a Bill Maher quote, "Whores are having a moment." Now, Pamela strikes me as a Bill Maher fan, like a real feminist. I am the only sex worker rights advocate that Pamela Paul chose to quote in this article, even though I know she spoke to several. And in part, I believe she chose me because I did sex work when I was 17, the same age my father joined the Army. And even though Pamela and I spoke for 90 minutes, instead of using one of the many quotes I provided her in our conversation, she chose to go with a quote she pulled from an episode from the first season of the Oldest Profession podcast and included a lot of filler words, like, in what feels to me like a transparent effort to make me sound less authoritative than I am. But even though Pamela Paul is obviously biased against this issue, the facts that she has to include as a journalist speak for themselves. Because even though I'm the only sex worker rights advocate she chose to quote, I am not alone. I stand with the World Health Organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Freedom Network, which is the largest provider of services to trafficking victims in the United States. But these incredible organizations do not stand with sex workers because they're beholden to the sex industry. They support the decriminalization of sex work because they understand that if this work is decriminalized, then the horrible crimes that Pamela Paul goes on to describe in great detail that she would like you to believe are an inevitable part of this industry could actually be prevented and reported if we were not members of a criminalized class. Before speaking with her, I had assumed that Pamela Paul was a legacy midwit who stumbled into her positions through dinner parties and social connections. But after speaking with her, I realize she's smart. Too smart to pretend to be stupid about this issue. And so, Pamela, I want to speak to you directly as a writer and as someone who considers yourself to be a feminist. Because stripping sex workers and trans women of their bodily autonomy and their ability to move freely in this world will not serve divorced, outspoken, public women like you well.